Today, there are 2 million descendants of French-Canadian immigrants living in New England. These are our stories. Welcome to the French-Canadian Legacy Podcast.
Venez tous jeunes filles et garçons, je vais vous raconter l'histoire de notre immigration ici au USA, de grands aventuriers, de pays étrangers.
This is the French-Canadian Legacy Podcast. I am Jesse Martineau, and today's episode marks yet another first for the French-Canadian Legacy Podcast, because for the very first time, we are speaking with somebody currently residing in France. So this is actually the first time we've had to navigate a time zone difference, which is kind of fun for us. Lynne Levesque is a blogger and author who has written a book about one of her ancestors. But Lynne's story herself is actually super interesting. She holds a degree in Russian studies, which is fun, from Mount Holyoke College, a master's degree in modern European history from Rutgers, an MBA from Cal Berkeley, a doctor of education from the University of Massachusetts. She had a very impressive business career, including time spent as a senior researcher at the Harvard Business School. However, Lynne's life has now taken a new path, documenting the life of Jeanne Chevalier, a fille du roi, which is super cool. And actually, I want to mention Jeanne's middle name because that's awesome too. Lynne, welcome to the French-Canadian Legacy Podcast.
Thank you very much, Jesse. I just want to make one slight correction.
Sure,
her name
please.
is Jeanne.
Jeanne, I appreciate that. Nice, Jeanne.
Jeanne, right.
Jeanne, was it Marguerite, correct?
Yeah, that's
Jeanne
right. Jeanne Marguerite Chevalier. Oui.
Right. Marguerite, I have, because that was my grandmother's name. My dad's mom's name was Marguerite. So I don't come across that very often. So I got excited when I saw that. Jeanne Marguerite Chevalier. All right. Thank you for the correction. I appreciate that. But I'd like to start with your personal story. So where are you from?
Well, I grew up in Nashua, New Hampshire. Not, how do we say this? I was not surrounded by my French-Canadian relatives the way my cousin was, because my mother was not French-speaking. She was a Swedish, Irish, Scotch background.
Gotcha.
And my father was interested in sort of differentiating himself from the French-Canadian community. But basically, Nashua, New Hampshire was full of Levesques and full of
Sure.
French-Canadian relatives.
Right. Now, why do you think your dad chose to kind of not pass along the language to you?
Well, I think it was a little complicated. I think there was, at that point in time, there was a movement to sort of move away from being French-Canadian. I mean, there was sort of two groups.
Sure.
The people who tried to keep their French-Canadian roots, like my cousin's family,
Right.
and then others who were trying to assimilate into the U.S. culture. And at that time in Nashua, New Hampshire, at least I felt that I think the family felt that there was a certain amount of, I don't know if you want to call it shame, but it was sort of, you were considered to be sort of French second-class citizens when you were French-Canadian.
Sure.
Immigrants.
Right.
And it wasn't until later, I grew up in the 40s and 50s, and it wasn't until later when Lynne Levesque, who was a very distant cousin, sort of brought more honor to being French-Canadian, that I think there was a sort of a revival of an interest in being French-Canadian, or a revival of pride in
Sure.
being French-Canadian. So my father, who had grown up speaking French, felt that it was also a sort of a handicap to be bilingual at that point in time, which I sort of wished, hey, Dad, I wish I had grown up speaking French,
Right.
but had to do it later in life.
Yeah, which I completely understand. It's a very similar story that we've heard from a lot of people. Both my parents grew up speaking French in the house, but didn't teach me or my sister. Kind of the same kind of thing. Yeah. So again, that was a Manchester story we hear over and over and over again. So it's kind of crazy. But as I mentioned in your bio, you've done a ton of super impressive things. Now, how did life take you to writing Jeanne's story?
Well, I can only say that Jeanne chose me to write her story, because in 1992, we were at a family reunion and received a copy of a family tree that took us back 11 generations to Robert Levesque and Jeanne Chevalier. And at that point in time, there are other stories written about Robert Levesque,
Sure.
but not about Jeanne. However, at that time, I was still very busy with my banking career and then later my consulting career. Something happened in about 2011, when I started looking on the internet, getting something about her story, and I contacted the archivist in Coutances to see if she could find a register of Jeanne's birth, because there was some controversy about where she was born. And the archivist in Coutances found her a register of her baptism. And so I went to Coutances, which is close to Mont Saint-Michel here in France.
Yep.
And received that and got a copy of that and went to the church where she was supposedly baptized, and something happened and I just became obsessed with telling Jeanne's story. I have no other explanation other than she chose me and she started haunting me. And it wasn't until 2015 and 2016 that I started getting very serious about doing this research, and that took me to writing the book about her.
Now, was it that research that brought you to France? Is that why we're speaking to you from France now?
No. Jeanne's story, I found most of Jeanne's story in Quebec.
Sure.
And in the research libraries in Harvard and in Boston, the Historical Genealogical Society in Boston, because most of the traces of Jeanne are in Quebec. So I took made several trips up to Quebec, and found most of her story there. And
Gotcha.
Here in France, there's no other trace of Jeanne until the mention of her parents in the first of her 3 marriage contracts. So what took me come back here was I came back in 2016 for a month. And I thought, well, I'll come back and spend a year here. And then in the middle of that year, I started, something just sort of drove me to saying, no, I'm going to staying for another year. And it just keeps happening that I'm staying here.
That's awesome.
I attribute it to Jeanne's spirit is here, because I'm living now in Dieppe in Normandy.
Okay. Yeah.
And there are many ties here between the Canada, Quebec, and Dieppe. And so Jeanne left France from Dieppe, and I just think her spirit is here, and it keeps me here.
Oh, that's awesome. Now, we've talked about the Fiduciary program on other episodes, but I have been reminded by a couple of different listeners that not everybody listens to the podcast in the order in which we record it. I guess a lot of people jumping on board like to start with the most recent and work backwards. So it's dangerous for me to just kind of assume that people have listened to our previous episodes. So maybe you can just tell us quickly what the Fiduciary program was about.
Okay, in 1534, Jacques Cartier claimed Canada for
Sure.
France, and there were sporadic visits to Canada from French fishermen and explorers. And in the 16th century, they decided that they wanted to spend more time collecting furs and doing more exploring of Canada. But nobody managed to want to stay in Canada. And so in the middle of the 1661, is that right? Louis XIV decided that he needed to spend some money colonizing Quebec, and that involved sending women over, because the fur traders, the farmers, the explorers weren't staying here or staying in Quebec. I don't know
Sure.
why I'm thinking I'm in Quebec, but staying in Canada. After their contract was up, or after a couple of years, they were coming back to France because there weren't women enough women in Canada.
Sure.
So Louis XIV in 1663 decided to, among many things that he did to sort of structure a more stable Quebec, he started sending over women to marry the traders and farmers and merchants in Quebec and start colonizing by having children there. And so that's the story of the Filles du Roi. Over the course of 11 years, from 1663 to 1673, Louis sent over almost 800 young women, their average age being in the 20s and late 20s, the average age, and married the men that were in Canada.
Gotcha. Now you talked about not finding a ton of Jeanne's life prior to her leaving for Canada. I'm just curious, what do we know about Jeanne's life prior to leaving, and what can we speculate about what her life might have been before she got on that boat?
Well, she was 26 years old when she got on the boat, it's according to my calculations. And she, 28 years old. She was 28 years old when she got on the boat. And the only thing that I can sort of hypothesize is that she was an orphan by her father, and life was just not all that great here in France at the time. The economic situation in France for peasants and even the smaller nobility, it was a horrible time in France. There were epidemics, there were ongoing wars, there were fights between the nobles, and so it just wasn't a very pleasant time to be living in France. And somebody must have encouraged her to decide to make this big move. And I can only assume that, from my speculation about Jeanne, she was, I might be, projecting backwards, an independent woman.
That's cool.
Who decided that she was going to look for a better life in France, in Quebec, sorry. And probably was encouraged to go there by her family, just because it wasn't a great time here in France. And she would have her pick of men there. That was not the case here in France. She didn't have a dowry, and she couldn't join a convent, and it wasn't like she could become a shopkeeper at that point in time in France. So the program, the Louis XIV program, the Filles du Roi program, gave them passage to Quebec. They provided them with a dowry or a gift upon their marriage, and provided them with some clothes. And so it was a big risk, but it wasn't the greatest risk in the world, because the program had a structure around it. When there were women who were protecting them on the boat, and there was a priest on the boat. And when they got to Quebec, they were greeted by administration, and they got to stay in dormitories for 2 or 3 months until they found their husband. So it wasn't like they were sent over, and then when they got over to Quebec, there was nothing there for them. It was a very structured program.
Sure. Now, one thing I always find curious is what the Filles du Roi knew about Quebec before they got there, what their expectations were. Do we have any way of knowing if they had any idea what they were getting into?
That's a very good question. I'm not sure. Only 25% of the women could read or write. So
Gotcha.
it wasn't like there were newspapers that would tell the stories, although there were people who were coming back from Quebec, so that there could be rumors. And I'm sure there were stories that came back, but the stories could also have been a little scary, because there were stories about people being killed by Amerindians, Canadian Aborigines. And so I'm not sure how much of a support those stories gave for their decisions to leave. But I'm sure there were rumors, but there was just nothing really official. although there was some communication among the religious community, because the nuns who went over to found the Hotel Dieu and the Ursuline Academy in Quebec did keep ties with their communities back here, as did the Jesuit priests.
Sure. Oh, that's cool. Now, do we know where she left from and how long that trip would have taken to get to Quebec?
My assumption is she left from Dieppe. The ship left from Dieppe in late June of 1671. The trip normally took about 6 weeks, and from what I can tell, there was a marriage contract in August 15th from what I think were the women on that boat. So her trip was probably one of the sort of median, the 6 week kind of trip, 6 or 7 week trip. I have a speech that I give here, and I talk about how life on that ship was probably not very comfortable. They were sort of squeezed into there like sardines, and we forget that there was no electricity, there was no running water, there were no toilets.
Right.
And they shared the ship with animals who were in the lower part of the ship, who were either being taken over to Quebec or were going to be used for food on the journey.
Right.
And so it was probably very smelly.
Yeah, for sure.
Not the most pleasant trip.
Right. No, absolutely. Now, do you have any idea how many filles du roi would have been on one of these ships?
Well, that's also another good question. There are no real records of how many ships went over. There's some belief that there were 2 ships that went over that year. There were 120 women in 1671 who were part of the Fiduciary Program in 1671. So there were either 120 on one boat, or if there were only one, or we don't really know. There's no ship rosters. And if you look on a couple of websites, they list 2 different ships. So it's somewhere between 20 and 120.
So quite a few then. Yeah. Okay. So she makes this trip, 6-7 weeks. Sounds like a pretty miserable trip. Gets off in Quebec City. Where does she go? What's the first place she visits? What do those first couple of months day to day look like?
All the women were taken to either 1 or 2 places, and that were within convent, with nuns protecting them, or with guardians protecting them. So they lived in dormitories, either in the Ursuline, if they stayed in Quebec, they stayed at the Ursuline Academy, or in a home across from the current Hotel Dieu, which is actually the original Hotel Dieu in Quebec. Something like another third of the women went on. I think a third stayed in Quebec City, a third went on to Trois-Rivières, and another third went on to Montreal, something like that. Not all of the women who came over that year stayed in Quebec City, but Jeanne did. And from what the understanding is, that the women went in, it was like there were halls that the women went into. And so it was like a matchmaking, that they, and we don't know why the different women went into the different halls, but they don't know whether it was class or, the region that they came from in France, because not all, and this is a really important point to make about these women and the men over there, is not all of them spoke the French that we know as French today, or the Quebec that they all had different dialects. So it's possible that they were shepherded into this room, into one of the rooms by where they came from. We don't know. But in any event, Jeanne found Guillaume Le Canteur, or Guillaume Le Canteur found Jeanne. We're not sure how that happened. We don't know why she picked the man she did. But within an estimated 2 months of when they arrived in Quebec, she and Guillaume Le Canteur were married, along with 9 other couples at the church that now was located where the Cathedral of Quebec in Quebec City is now.
Nice.
That's the building. So that's where they were married. And it's funny to sort of think about what kind of a ceremony they had. They certainly weren't wearing white dresses. and didn't have flowers and all that kind of stuff. But in any event, they were married along with 9 or 10 other couples, and all the couples received some additional goods, for starting a farm and things like that for their first homestead. One of the things we do know about the choices for these women is that it was very important that the man they had a home, and so they asked questions about their living style and their home. Sure. And so Jeanne and her first husband moved to a farm that he had rented close to Charlebourg. I think that's how they pronounce it in Quebec City now. A little suburb of Quebec City.
Gotcha.
But within less than a year, they were moving to another village in Lange Gardien, closer to Saint-Anne-de-Beaupré.
Okay.
And at that point, Jeanne was pregnant. So they lived in Lange Gardien for 7 years, roughly, until her husband disappeared.
Okay. Well, what would her day-to-day life have looked like during this first period?
Well, that's, they were married on October, I don't have the date exact, October 21st, something like that. And they moved directly to their farm. Now, remember, this is October in Quebec.
Yeah, so absolutely.
They had to get there very quickly, get the farm, get all their supplies guarded, stored away.
Yeah.
And they had to bring in whatever they needed to harvest, and because the winter was coming.
Sure.
So and she brought over something like 300 livres, which was the money of the time, worth of goods, of her personal belongings. And I'm assuming that she had sort of some sheets and blankets and things like that that she brought over with her. And their first home was probably a one-room cabin. Again, no electricity, no running water, and even in the middle of winter, they had to go outside to go to the bathroom, I guess. I don't know all those details.
Gotcha. Yeah.
But she had to learn to cook with new vegetables, cook with new spices. The life of these women, I think, has not been described as well as it should be, because they were the real pioneers. I mean, they're the ones who had to figure out how to cook with the new vegetables, new fruits, new spices, new wildlife, and they had to make do. Now, Jeanne, as far as I know, was a city girl.
Right. Yeah.
And so she had to learn how to bake bread, and they used to, from what I understand, they ate a pound or more of bread a day. So she had to learn how to cook bread quite quickly. So life was not all that easy.
Yeah, no, it doesn't sound like it at all. And as you alluded to earlier, this is not her last marriage, but what do we know about the end of this first marriage? What details do we have about what happened to her first husband?
Her first husband was an entrepreneur. He was not a farmer who wanted to sort of stick around on the farm. So he was buying and selling property, and he was getting into financial trouble, and he disappeared sometime around the birth of their third child in 1678. We don't know anything about his death. We don't have the death certificate. But the assumption was that he died somewhere out on a fishing or a hunting trip, and he was buried out there without a priest around to do the death certificate. So roughly 9 months later, she married Robert Levesque. We don't know how she met Robert Levesque. I have several different guesses that there were friends who communicated, but remember, Lange Gardien is on the north shore of the St. Lawrence, about 20 kilometers from Quebec City, and Robert Levesque, her second husband, was living in Rivière-Ouelle, which is 100 on the southern shore of the St. Lawrence, about 150 kilometers from Quebec City.
Okay.
Somehow they connected. And
all right.
without telephones, without the internet, without newspapers announcing the availability of a new woman or a man or whatever. But Robert Levesque's story is also interesting. He came over, I believe, on the same ship as Jeanne, but he was committed to a 3-year contract with the lord whose land that they were going to colonize. And so he had to wait 3 years before he could even think about getting married. So that puts him at 1674, after all the filles du roi have already arrived, and most of them were married at that point. So he's looking for a wife, presumably. Somehow he found out about, now Jeanne, 3 or 4 years later, Jeanne is a widow with 3 young children, but 3 young children, and all of them boys, were eventually going to be able to be farmhands for Robert Levesque, and as he developed his farm. So somehow they connected, and they got married and moved from L'Ange Gardien to Rivière-Ouelle.
What did Rivière-Ouelle look like, and how would that have been kind of a different scenario than she had been in when she first settled?
That's another really great question, Jesse. L'Ange Gardien was close to Quebec City and was part of the area that was already fairly settled. And so in L'Ange Gardien, Jeanne had lots of neighbors. Rivière-Ouelle, by the time she arrived there were less than 10 families, and they were in the most eastern seigneurie. One of the problems is I'm thinking French and English at the same time.
Not a problem.
Signoria, the Lord's property.
Sure.
A fief, I guess is what you might call it. It was one of the most eastern of those. In fact, it was the most eastern at that point in time. So it's a pretty wild area. Weren't a lot of Amerindians at that point in time around there. They had all sort of moved away. It was wild, and not the same kind of village that she was used to.
Gotcha.
And so she didn't have neighbors. At my estimation at that point is there might have been about 5 or 6 other women there at the time, including the Lord's wife. And so Jeanne arrives in 1679. Eventually the place grows, but in 1681 there was a census taken, and there were only 10 families there at the time.
Oh, so this would have been by far the most rural place she had ever lived in her entire life.
Yes, frontier, I would call it, almost more than rural, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, no. So how long did this marriage last?
That marriage lasted 20 years. She had 6 more children with Robert, 5 boys and 1 girl. 3 of them survived, and of the children she had with the sons that she had with Guillaume, they all died before they were able to marry. So she is survived only by 3 sons. So she had 9 children, and only 3 of them survived her.
Oh, that's wild. So what brought the end to this marriage?
He died of an epidemic. One of her sons with Guillaume died shortly thereafter, and so there was an epidemic at the point in time, and he died right after his 57th birthday. Then a year and a half later, she married the Lord. I like to think of it as her first marriage was, sort of a disaster. The second one was a very secure marriage, and then she ended her 3rd marriage was she found her prince.
Oh, there you go. Things moving up. Now, right. It's funny. Now, how old would she have been at the time of this 3rd marriage?
She was 57 at the time. That, according to the register of that marriage, She was 57 years old at the time, and her husband, Lord Deschamps, was 55 years old.
Okay, and I'm curious. You would think at 57 she wouldn't necessarily need to remarry. So, why do you think she went ahead and did
There again, we have wonderful stories to tell.
that?
Um, I had a fairy tale telling that he was also on the ship, I believe, along with Jeanne and her second, and Robert Levesque.
Gotcha.
And they could have, crossed eyes on the upper deck of the ship. But then he couldn't marry her at that time because she was a peasant girl and
Sure.
he was of nobility. His family was a long-term noble family here in France. And so then when he lost his first wife in 1681, but by that time Jeanne arrives back, gets back in touch with him but
Sure.
she's married.
Gotcha.
Then Robert dies in 1699, and they decide they're finally, their star-crossed love, and finally they can marry, because by that time the class lines had broken down, and Deschamps, her third husband, Jean-Baptiste François Deschamps de la Bouteillerie, was was one of the noblemen who stayed on his property. There were other noblemen who continued to live in Quebec City and live a social life there, but Jean-Baptiste was one of the few who stayed on the property to try to develop the property the way he had promised the king he would do.
Sure.
So that's the romantic story. I have a distant relative, Ulrich Levesque, who has written a book about Robert Levesque, and his hypothesis is that Deschamps sold gave his manoir, his home, to the church, and he didn't have any place to live at that point in time.
Okay.
And Jeanne and Robert had just bought a property. They were quite, enterprising farmers. They just bought a neighboring property that had a home on it. So at that point in time, Deschamps probably, according to Ulrich Levesque,
Sure.
moved into one of the homes there. By the time Robert died, her first son, by Robert, was getting ready to get married, and he needed a place to live. So the idea was that Jean-Baptiste, the Lord, needed to move out of the house so that Jeanne's first son could move into the house with his bride. And so where was he going to go? There wasn't a lot of rentable property at the time, or, Airbnbs or any of those kinds of things. So the idea was he was going to come live with Jeanne, and therefore, in order to live with Jeanne, he needed to marry her.
So his hypothesis, it was a very practical agreement.
Yes, very, very practical. Exactly. Then there's also the idea that perhaps he was ill. They had become good friends because they lived just across the little river from each other. And so, they're growing old, and so they decide that they should grow old together. So there's at least 3 possibilities.
I got you. Well, this is all way fun because it's a story of a fille du roi comes to Quebec with seemingly very little, and eventually the story ends with her acquiring a title and having it's super fascinating.
Yes, it is. The question of her title is interesting because she actually didn't become seigneuress. She became, or Lady Deschamps, she became Madame de la Bouteillerie. And my assumption is that that's because she was not of nobility, that
Gotcha.
she couldn't. Now there's some question about whether I'm right or wrong about that, but in any event, she actually became Madame de la Bouteillerie. She lived on. They got married in 1701. He died in 1703. So for the remaining 13 years of her life, she stayed a widow. But she stayed in Rivière-Well, and she died in November of 1716, but in 1713 she had a will written, which was quite unusual for women at that time. In fact, even for men at that time, but to have a woman having a will was quite unusual. So, which is why I think that Jeanne was a pretty independent, strong woman.
Gotcha.
To have done that at the end. And she arranged, before her third husband died, they had arranged for the division of her property, but she needed to be taken care of by one of the sons. And so the property was all taken care of, but she still had to leave a will in which she left some money to her first goddaughter, and money for masses to be said at 8 different churches, about,
Oh, wow.
that connected with where she had lived. So she had a little bit of money that she wanted to distribute at the end of her life, but she was also very conscious about her expenses, because she wanted to be buried in the most the least expensive way. And she wanted to have mass. She was a good Catholic, and she wanted to have masses said for her. So she was a fascinating woman.
That's awesome.
I think, yes.
That's very cool. Now, because first of all, the research that has to go in this would kind of blows my mind. But how did you find this will?
That's another very interesting story. Because Ulrich, who had done the biography of Robert Levesque, did not know about the will. I was just, going through the microfilm.
Sure.
In Boston at the Historical Genealogical Society, and just managed, as I was reeling the films, to just catch it to see it. And I just never would have found it if I hadn't been slowly going through the microfilms.
Sure.
Because there was no reference to it until I did find a reference to it later. But it was just, no, it was luck, or it was Jeanne making me stop at that point so that I could see her will. Yes.
That is awesome. Well, this is a super interesting story. It's a super interesting book. This is awesome. So what are you working on now?
Well, I have several projects here. One is I'm spreading the word about Jeanne and the Filles du Roi. The Filles du Roi program in Quebec and Canada is fairly well known.
Sure.
Here in France, it's not as very well known, and it has there's some myths about it, and so I do presentations dressed as Jeanne.
That's cool.
And to spread the word about her life and about the Filles du Roi program. So that's one thing. The second thing is I'm trying to do more research on the life of her third husband. Gotcha. In 2022 will be the 350th anniversary of the founding of Rivière-Well by Deschamps, her third husband. And so I'm trying to find information on his birth, but I'm running into more dead ends here.
Gotcha.
And so that's a piece of, I'm continuing a little bit of research, not a lot. But I'm also in my book on Jeanne, the book is written as a historical book, as best I could with some, imagination.
Sure.
But it's about Jeanne, and it's not about my story of all the people I met or all the experiences I had, or
right.
So I'm trying to write a second book to tell the story of how I came to tell the story of Jeanne.
Yeah, I mean, I have the book in front of me right now. We'll make sure to put a link to it. What do you think is the easiest way for people to get a hold of this book?
Well, if it's available on Amazon.com, Amazon.ca, also Amazon.fr.
Nice.
So it's available in both English and French.
Very cool.
And if anyone is in Boston, it's also available at the Harvard Bookstore on, what's the main street in Cambridge? It's in the Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge.
Gotcha.
Those are probably the easiest ways. It's also available here in Dieppe if they want to come to Dieppe.
Very cool. They're stopping by. That's awesome. Yeah, I get the book in front of me now. It's great. Now, how about the blog? And how often do you post on there? I assume that keeps active. I've seen. Yeah.
Well, yes, I try to keep that active, but I'm not as good a blogger as I'm sure you are. I get caught up in, studying French, doing some things, interesting things here in Dieppe. And so I maybe post 3, 4 times a year. It's not frequent.
It's enough. It's cool. I mean, you're doing a ton of work.
Yeah, well, thank you.
That's awesome. All right. And what is the name of the blog so people can get to it?
It's available on www.lynnelevesque.com. Important that it's LYNNELEVESQUE.com. And so the blog is there.
Awesome. Well, Lynn, this has been the story is super interesting. I learned a ton getting ready for this interview. So I really, really appreciate you coming on. Thank you very much, Lynn.
Thank you for the interview, and thank you for your very interesting questions.
Now our fathers look at us and sigh with despair, to think that everything they love we simply do not share. But the spirit never dies, our culture will survive. Each of us must choose how much to keep alive. Each of us must choose how much to keep alive.
Special thanks to Josie Vachon for providing the music. You can find more about her at josievachon.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Mike Campbell. If you have any questions or comments, please email us at fclpodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at FCL Podcast for more information about the topics discussed. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you listen to this episode.